It started on a quiet Sunday evening when I first heard him cry. At first, I thought it was the television, the muffled sound of some late-night drama leaking through the paper-thin walls that separated our houses. But after a moment, I realized it wasn't a performance. It was a man, alone, crying softly into the kind of silence that only grief can make. That was the night I really noticed Daniel Carter, my next-door neighbor that we'd spoken before, in the easy, forgettable ways neighbors often do, about garbage pickup days, about how the rain always flooded the sidewalk in front of our mailboxes. He had always seemed steady, composed. A husband with a tidy front lawn and a wife who waved politely when she watered the roses. Then, a month ago, her car stopped appearing in the driveway, and the house next door began to look abandoned in the evenings. The blinds stayed closed, the porch light stayed off. That I didn't know the details then, but I'd heard pieces of the story from passing conversation. Daniel's wife, Clara, had filed for divorce. After years of trying, she had simply left. The neighborhood, with its obsession for whispered updates, quickly moved on. But I hadn't. There was something about his quiet house that drew my attention every night when I closed my curtains. That Sunday, I sat on my couch pretending to read, but I couldn't focus. His sobs rose and fell like waves, sporadic, broken. I kept thinking I should go over, maybe knock on his door, ask if he was all right. But I didn't. Instead, I sat still, listening, feeling something tighten in my chest that wasn't quite pity, and not quite curiosity either. The next morning, I saw him outside for the first time in weeks. He was sitting on his porch steps, a mug in his hand, staring at nothing. His hair looked unwashed, his clothes mismatched, an image of exhaustion. I was locking my car when he noticed me. For a second, I thought he might turn away, but instead he gave a faint nod, the kind that asks for neither company nor distance. "Morning," I said, unsure if he'd even respond. That he nodded again. "Morning, Ethan." His voice sounded rough, like someone had taken sandpaper to it. There was a silence heavy enough to fill the space between us. I could have left right then, driven to work, forgotten about it. But something about the slump in his shoulders made me stay. "How are you holding up?" I asked, and immediately felt foolish for choosing such a cliché. That he looked at me then, really looked. "It's been 29 days, he said quietly. That I didn't understand what he meant until he added, "since she left." There was nothing I could say to that. 29 days. The precision of it felt like a wound he'd been counting, a mark of devotion or torment, I couldn't tell which. That evening, I found him again, sitting in the same spot, a bottle of beer beside him. The sun was setting, casting that tired orange glow over the street, and the sound of sprinklers and cicadas filled the air. I told myself I was just taking out the trash, but I lingered by the fence between our yards. That he noticed, of course. "You can come over," he said. "It's not a crime to talk to the sad guy next door." I hesitated, then walked over. The wood of his porch creaked beneath my feet as I sat across from him. We didn't speak for a while. He just stared into the empty space in front of him, and I followed his gaze. "To nothing." "She used to sit right there," he said finally, pointing to the step beside him. "Every night, she'd talk about the day, and I'd just listen. I thought that meant we were fine." "Maybe you were, for a while," I offered, not sure why my voice came out softer than I intended. That he smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Or maybe I just wasn't listening hard enough. He took a long sip of beer, then passed the bottle toward me. I shook my head. "I don't drink." "Good," he said. "Somebody around here should stay sober." There was a strange comfort in the quiet that followed. The kind of quiet that didn't demand conversation. The air smelled faintly of rain and dust. I could feel the weight of his grief without him describing it. It hung around him like smoke. When he finally spoke again, it was almost a whisper. "I thought I'd be angry," he said. "But mostly I'm just tired. Like my house is too big for me now. Like every sound inside it reminds me of her footsteps." I wanted to say something meaningful, something that could lift even a corner of that weight, but all I managed was, "It'll get easier." He looked at me then, eyes glassy under the porch light. You think so? I have to, I said. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it? He gave a quiet laugh, the first I'd heard from him. You talk like someone who's been through it. Not quite, I said. But I know what it's like to live next to someone else's silence. He turned toward me, studying my face for a moment longer than felt natural. It wasn't suspicion, it was recognition. That strange moment when pain meets understanding. He nodded once, slow, as if acknowledging something unspoken between us. The night deepened around us, and our conversation faded into small talk, work, the neighborhood, the broken mailbox that no one ever fixed. It was trivial, yet it felt necessary, as if the normality of it might keep him anchored for one more evening. When I finally stood to leave, he looked reluctant to let the moment end. Thanks, he said, voice low. You didn't have to sit with me. I know, I replied. But I wanted to. As I walked back to my house, I could still feel the heaviness of his presence beside me. I closed my door, switched off the lights, and lay down. The neighborhood was silent again, except it wasn't. Through the thin wall, I could hear faint sounds from next door, a chair scraping the floor, the soft clink of a bottle, and then, after a pause, the sound of him crying again. This time, I didn't try to tune it out. I listened, eyes open in the dark, feeling his grief travel through the walls and settle somewhere inside me, and for the first time in a long while, I realized how easy it is for loneliness to find its echo, in the person living right next door. The sound faded gradually, like rain easing after a storm. But long after his sobs stopped, I was still awake, my mind replaying the way he'd said those words, 29 days, as if every one of them had carved a new shape into his heart. I wondered how long it would take before he stopped counting. When I finally drifted into sleep, his voice still lingered, soft and broken, on the other side of the wall. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. I would see Daniel outside most evenings, sitting on the porch with a quiet patience, as if waiting for something that no longer existed. I began to find excuses to walk past his house, to check the mail, to water a plant I barely cared for, to pretend I had a reason to be near him. Each time, he looked a little different, sometimes shaven and calm, sometimes lost in thought, and sometimes holding that same half-empty beer bottle, like a habit he couldn't break. One Thursday evening, he called out to me. Ethan, he said, leaning over the fence, you're always out here alone. You ever eat dinner with someone, or is solitude your thing too? I smiled, caught off guard by the sudden familiarity. Depends who's asking. Someone who's tired of takeout and silence. That was how it began, dinners that felt harmless, ordinary. The first night, we ordered Chinese food and sat in his living room, the air filled with the faint scent of soy and ginger. The space felt strangely hollow, like a house rearranging itself after being emptied. I noticed that the walls were bare where picture frames had once hung. There was a faint tan line where Clara's photos used to be. He caught me looking. She took the frames, too, he said, without bitterness. Didn't even leave the nails. We both laughed, but it was a quiet, tired kind of laughter. Our conversations drifted from small talk into something heavier, like water seeping through a crack. Daniel spoke about his marriage the way some people talk about weather, inevitable, unchangeable. We stopped talking years before we stopped being married, he said. I just didn't notice the silence anymore. I listened, unsure what role I played in his healing, a neighbor, a witness, or something he hadn't named yet. I told him about my own failed relationships, about how I'd learned to fill loneliness with work and distraction. He smiled faintly. Guess we're both specialists in pretending. The more time we spent together, the more I began to recognize the small details of him, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was uncertain, the pause he took before admitting anything personal, the low hum he made when he was thinking. There was no clear moment when concern turned into something else, but I started to feel it, a quiet pull I couldn't rationalize. One evening, I found him fixing a loose porch step. He was wearing an old gray t-shirt, the kind softened by years of wear. His forearms were streaked with sawdust. He looked up and grinned. Want to hand me that screwdriver? I did, And as our fingers brushed, something unspoken passed between us, fleeting but unmistakable. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued working as if nothing had happened. I tried to act natural, but my heart gave itself away. When the step was done, he sat back and sighed. You ever feel like you're rebuilding something you know will never be the same again? I nodded. All the time. He looked at me, eyes catching the fading light. That's what this house feels like. Every nail I drive in just reminds me of what's missing. That night, the air turned colder. A thin drizzle began, and the smell of wet soil filled the neighborhood. I helped him carry the tools inside. His living room was dim, the light of a single lamp stretching long shadows across the floor. Music played softly from a speaker, something slow and instrumental. Stay for a bit, he said. It's miserable out there. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, our conversation wandering. He asked me about my family, my work, my reasons for staying in this town. I answered honestly, though I could feel his attention resting on more than my words. The rain intensified, tapping steadily against the windows. At one point, he leaned back and exhaled. It's strange, he said. I spent years trying to be what she wanted, strong, reliable, predictable. But in the end, none of that mattered. She said I'd become a stranger. Maybe she just stopped seeing you, I said quietly. He turned to me, eyes searching. Do you? The question hung between us, heavier than it should have been. I could hear the sound of the rain, the slow rhythm of my heartbeat, and the space between his words. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. No, I said finally. I see you. Something shifted in the air then, like the pause before a storm breaks. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered long enough for meaning to settle. The moment didn't need words, it lived in the silence, in the closeness of two people who had nowhere else to place their loneliness. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room. We both flinched, half laughing at our reaction, but the tension remained, quiet, fragile, real. He reached for the remote to turn the music down, and his hand brushed my knee. He froze, then pulled back, muttering, sorry. Don't be, I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me again, the apology fading from his face, replaced by something else, a kind of recognition neither of us had wanted to admit. The rain outside softened, turning into a steady whisper. We sat there in silence, the distance between us shrinking until it wasn't just physical anymore. I could feel the weight of what wasn't being said pressing into the air around us. I thought about how dangerous it was, not in the obvious sense, but in the quiet, emotional way that leaves marks you can't explain. He was the first to move. Slowly, he stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the dark street. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, he said. Every time I start to feel alive again, it feels like betrayal. Maybe it's just healing, I said. They look the same sometimes. He didn't answer, just nodded faintly, his reflection a shadow against the glass. Then he turned back to me. You should probably head home. It's late. The dismissal was gentle, not cold. I stood, unsure of what to say, feeling the moment slip between us like smoke. As I reached the door, he spoke again, softly, almost as if to himself. Thank you for staying. I hesitated. You don't have to thank me. He smiled, small, tired, and real. I think I do. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world still smelled of it, damp earth, clean air, a kind of freshness that felt undeserved. I walked the short distance to my house, feeling both lighter and heavier at once. Later that night, lying in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind, every glance, every silence, every word left hanging. There had been no confession, no touch that crossed a line, yet everything in me knew that something irreversible had begun. Through the thin wall, I could hear faint movement again, footsteps, maybe, or a restless soul pacing in the dark. I wondered if Daniel was awake too, haunted by the same questions. Before I fell asleep, one thought settled in me with quiet certainty: whatever we had become, it wasn't just neighbors anymore. And whatever was coming next, neither of us was ready to name it. The silence between us lasted 3 days. Neither of us crossed the invisible line that separated our houses. I told myself it was better that way, that distance would dilute whatever had formed between us that night. But every time I walked past his porch, I felt the weight of what wasn't said. His curtain stayed closed. His porch light stayed off. Even the faint sounds I had grown used to, the music, the footsteps, were gone. On the fourth evening, I found a note slipped under my door. It was Daniel's handwriting, uneven and smudged. "I'm sorry if I made things strange. I've been trying to make sense of myself, but it's a mess I can't think through alone. If you're not angry, come by tonight. I'll be outside." I stood there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let silence become the ending. But the truth was, I missed him, his voice, his company, even the sadness that seemed to cling to him. It had become a part of my days, something familiar in its brokenness. When I finally walked over, the night was cold enough to turn breath visible. Daniel sat on the porch steps, a blanket over his shoulders, a glass in his hand. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. "You came," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure I should," I admitted. "I wasn't sure I'd be brave enough to ask." We both smiled faintly, but it didn't last. The air was thick with hesitation that he gestured toward the empty spot beside him, and I sat. For a while, neither of us spoke. The street was empty, the only sound the low hum of the distant highway. "I've been thinking," he said finally, voice low, "about what you said that night. About healing." I turned to look at him. His face was softer in the dim light, tired, yes, but open. "What about it?" "I don't think I know how," he said. "Everything I do feels like I'm betraying the person I used to be. The husband I thought I was. Even sitting here with you," he stopped, searching for words, "it feels like crossing a line I can't name." His honesty stung more than I expected. "Maybe you're just finding a different part of yourself," I said. "Not betraying, just uncovering." He laughed softly, bitterly. "And what if I don't like what I find?" I looked at him then, really looked, the man who'd spent 29 days grieving a marriage, the man trying to rebuild himself from ashes. "Then you face it anyway," I said. "That's the only way it ever gets real." He met my eyes, and the quiet stretched until it became something alive. Then, almost without thinking, he reached for my hand. His fingers trembled, unsure, but he didn't pull back. I could have moved, could have broken the spell, but I didn't. "I don't know what this is," he whispered. "I just know I don't want to feel alone tonight." I didn't answer with words. I just let my hand stay in his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the pulse beneath it. It wasn't passion, not yet. It was need, raw and human, the kind born from long nights of silence that we stayed like that for a while, hands intertwined, neither daring to look at the other. Then, without a word, he stood and opened the door. "Come in," he said. Inside, the house felt different, warmer, softer. The scent of coffee hung faintly in the air. The lamp on the side table glowed low and amber, painting everything in gold and shadow. He poured another drink, then handed me a glass. "To new mistakes," he said with a crooked smile. "To honesty," I replied. That he nodded, sipping slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark window. The tension between us was no longer uncertain, it had become something we both understood but didn't know how to name. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I spent years pretending I knew who I was," he said. "And when she left, I thought the hardest part would be losing her. But it turns out, it's losing the version of myself that existed only because she was watching." I set my glass down. "Maybe this is who you are without the performance." He turned toward me, a question forming behind his eyes. "And you?" he asked. "What are you looking for in all this?" I hesitated. The truth came slowly. "I don't know. Maybe just connection. Maybe I saw someone drowning in silence and didn't realize I was already standing in the same water." He reached up then, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, an almost unconscious gesture of intimacy. The space between us vanished in that small motion. And when he leaned forward, I didn't pull away. The kiss was hesitant, almost clumsy, more confession than desire. It wasn't about passion, it was about recognition. The quiet understanding that neither of us had expected this, yet both had been moving toward it for weeks. When we broke apart, he looked stunned, as if he'd stepped into sunlight after too long in the dark. "Ethan," he whispered, my name sounding fragile in his mouth. "It's all right," I said, though it wasn't. It was complicated, terrifying, and inevitable. He exhaled shakily, turning away. "I don't want to hurt anyone again. Not even you." "You won't," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We sat there for a long time, side by side, the unspoken truth thick between us. The rain began again, soft and steady against the windows. By the time I stood to leave, the clock had crept past midnight. Daniel followed me to the door, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For seeing me." I smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Outside, the air was cold and damp, the kind that clings to skin. I paused at the edge of the porch, unsure whether to look back. When I finally did, Daniel was still standing there, the porch light catching in his eyes. He looked like someone trying to memorize a moment before it disappeared. When I reached my house, I leaned against the door for a long time, listening to the distant echo of rain. My pulse hadn't slowed. My thoughts tangled between guilt and longing. Something had changed, and there was no undoing it now. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, his face, the quiet ache in his voice, the way he said my name like it meant something more than it should. Just before dawn, I stood at my window and looked toward his house. The light in his living room was still on. He hadn't slept either. It struck me then that what we'd found wasn't a love story, not yet. It was two people standing at the edge of something vast, uncertain, and dangerous, something that might heal us, or break us completely. As the first gray light touched the sky, I whispered to the empty room, "Whatever this is, it's real." And that truth, as terrifying as it was, refused to let me look away.